we are in fact capable of having these huge realizations, ones that actually overwhelm us, make us feel that we are understanding something that we perhaps shouldn't, that we shouldn't go there, this idea of, where angels fear to tread.
In a material world, true knowledge can come from the things we can see, hear, and touch, because these are what scientists can measure and sometimes turn into beautiful truths.
The more I thought about how it comes to be that our perception of the world at a deep level matches our perception of beauty, it's a puzzle. It poses a deep mystery.
But are there other truths we can discover, which come from pure thought or imagination?
Discovering mathematics is messy, like making love, it's messy. As new mathematics always is. And then moments like that, you say, well, it wasn't me, I didn't discover this. This idea exists out there independently of me, and maybe it wanted to use me to express itself.
Would these ideas also be real and true? Or would they be just figments of our imagination?
We have no instrument by which to record the absolute nature of reality, because whatever instrument that is will at some point be filtered through the lens of consciousness of us.
Professor Ard Louis is an Oxford physicist who believes that reality is rational and mechanical and whose rules are ultimately scientific and mathematical. But he also believes that there are truths that are not part of the material world. Truths placed there by God, a God who wants us to know those truths. Like Professor Louis, filmmaker David Malone also feels that some truths are more than just human inventions. But as a non-believer, the idea of a God who somehow put those truths in the world so we would know them just makes no sense to him. Together they are on a journey to reconcile their intuitions about truth and meaning, and perhaps even God, to life in a material world. More than any other animal, human beings shape the objects and the world we live in. Not just the physical, the things made by our hands, but those made by our minds as well. And these objects and ideas then shape us in return. But are the only truths those which science can prove? For Professor Louis, the answer is absolutely not. Not because of his belief in God, but because of his study of mathematics.
And if the mathematics was just a game that we played in our heads, then maybe you could say we made it up, like we made up the rules of chess. But in fact, mathematics has this really extraordinary hold on the physical world. It allows us to peer into the physical world much more deeply than we feel we ought to just on the power of our own brains. Mathematics is like this magical telescope that allows us to see way, way, way further. And so that suggests that it's been out there all along. And so you feel like you discover it.
It's still there, regardless of us. It was there before we came along.
Exactly.
I didn't really understand how profound a challenge this mathematical feeling of Ard's is to the material, scientific view of the world, until we went to talk to one of the world's greatest mathematicians, Roger Penrose.
So what I'd be curious to see is whether Roger thinks mathematics is discovered or whether he thinks it's created.
Well, I certainly belong to the school of thought that it's discovery, but you have to be a little bit careful about this. Mathematical ideas, I think, are things which are in a sense out there, even though ideas are things in our heads in a sense, they're our own thoughts. But suppose you're trying to prove some mathematical result. There are lots of ways at arriving at this result, and there's an element of what you might call invention there.
Okay, but the destination you're getting to already exists.
That's the way I would view it, yes. And
right.
There's a degree, you might say, how can something have a degree of existence or not? Well, I think it's true in a sense. You could do this. You could have certain ideas which in mathematics have a deeper existence than others. And you can maybe invent various mathematical schemes, you could say, and I'll use the word invention there because, they might be interesting to play with. But then some of these have features which reveal deep truths which you had no conception of before. And I think that the best example I can think of is the idea of complex numbers. I, which is a so-called imaginary number, it's the square root of -1. Now you see, these come about from the crazy idea that the square root of -1 exists, if you like. If you have a negative number and you square it, you get a positive number. If you have a positive number, you square it, you get a positive number. So how can you get a negative number when you square it? Well, you have to invent something. So if you want to know what the square root of -1 is, well, we call it I. Well, that looks like a pure invention.
Yes, it does.
Now, you see, the thing is, what's deep about it is that if you introduce this notion, which at first sight looks like an invention, it unfolds an entire world that you had no conception of. And you didn't invent that. That came as a gift. Now, you see, there's an additional piece of mystery or magic here too. Not just does it open the world of mathematics and give you insights in all sorts of things in mathematics that you hadn't got before, then along comes quantum mechanics. And this quantum mechanics turns out to be fundamentally based on these complex numbers. And if you didn't have this idea, the mathematical idea of imaginary numbers, you couldn't do quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics tells us that the world is based on these strange numbers. It's the door. It opens up into this world, and the world it's a huge garden, if you like, with incredible things wherever you look. But you wouldn't have the door. That's the gate to that world.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
So they were there before we even thought of them?
They were there all the time. They've been there since the beginning of time. These numbers are embedded in the way the world works at the smallest and, if you like, most basic level.
So they're woven in to the fabric?
They're very much essentially part of the fabric. The fabric couldn't exist without them.
When you've told me in the past about mathematics just existing, and when I was listening to you in Penrose, that it's something you're not making up, you're discovering, it does seem right. But the problem is, once I saw you and Roger putting little squiggles on the blackboard, I then looked at those and I thought, wait a minute, how do they exist?
Yeah. What's a non-material reality?
See, I can cope with that when you say, well, it's the realm of ideas.
Yeah.
Because that's obviously true. There's a whole realm of ideas, and I wander around it, we all do. But then when you say some of those ideas, they're the part of the universe, just like Mars is part of the universe. That starts to get more difficult.
It's if you only think about real things as physical objects, then it seems strange. But why would
ideas are definitely real.
Yeah.
It's only this notion that some of them...
Well, because ideas are things you made up.
Yes.
But these are things you didn't make up. They're just real.
They're just in the universe.
So I do realize that for some people, this talk of non-physical reality has a worryingly, almost quasi-religious tone. After all, for the scientific atheist, there's nothing outside of physical reality. But if mathematical truths truly exist out there, but are not part of the world of atoms and molecules, then they are a non-material reality, alongside but separate from the physical. It's kind of wild. There are thoughts that are quite constrained, like mathematical thoughts. Right? So I say 1 + 1 = 2, but the fact that 1 + 1 = 2 is independent of whether or not my brain does those things, right? So the mathematics is true regardless of whether bosons or fermions exist. Is that right?
Yes, and there I think you have the major problem on the research program of scientism. The scientistic worldview, I think, has very good answers to a huge range of the questions that really trouble human beings when they can't get to sleep at night and they're looking up at the ceiling and wondering about themselves and their place in the universe. The domain in which we have the most trouble is the nature of mathematics and our knowledge of mathematical truths. As you just said, it looks very much like mathematical truths are true independent of anybody's ever having thought them. Many people are inclined to think that mathematics is just, ideas in the head. But it can't be for a lot of reasons, and we've recognized this ever since Plato. Okay? And the one thing that we, scientistic philosophers, don't yet have a good account of is how we can have knowledge of mathematics. Because we think that knowledge is a causal process that involves an interaction between us and the objects of knowledge. And 2 and equals and prime number, these are abstract objects that do not exist in space and time. And so our knowledge of mathematics is a deep mystery.
Not only do mathematical truths seem to exist in their own non-material reality, but that world of pure ideas seems to be able to tell us how our material world works in ways that are uncanny and hard to explain. The most famous example being the equation discovered by Paul Dirac in St. John's College in Cambridge.
This Dirac equation is the first really pure example of predicting something completely new, a new type of matter, just on the basis of mathematics. In 1926, Erwin Schrödinger just came up with quantum mechanics, which is the theory of very small things. And so Dirac was thinking, well, what happens if I take quantum mechanics, the theory of very small things, and I make something small move very fast? Well, if it moves very fast, then it has to transform according to the laws of Einstein's special relativity. The only way you can mathematically make that work is by having a second particle. And a little bit later, he identified it as the positron. A positron is antimatter.
He's imagining antimatter.
He's not imagining it. Mathematics is imposing it on the world.
Then what's so weird about that is that the mathematics says, if you look over there, this is what you'll find, and when you find it, this is how it'll work. How does that work?
If you look over there in reality, there's something that you've never imagined before, and when you look at it, it will do all these amazing things.
And it just falls out of the maths.
Yeah, that's just all the maths. It's amazing. I mean, you see a very famous essay by the Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner, which he says a gift we neither understand nor deserve. In fact, he calls it a miracle, although he was an atheist. He didn't think it was God doing something magical.
Then what does that tell you?
Well, so for me, it's in some sense a pointer to God. I don't mean it's some kind of proof of God, but it's something more like this. If I start from the assumption that there is a God, and then I look at the world, that's maybe not so surprising that something like mathematics would be woven into the world and allow us to predict things that we should never be able to predict. Whereas if I start from the assumption that there's nothing but atoms and molecules, it's very surprising that the world has this.
No, it is surprising. I mean, I grant you that.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I mean, I'm
It's not a
with you.
proof.
It doesn't make me think there must be a God, but it is so weird. You've got to come up with some answer because I don't see.
It's extraordinary and amazing.
We can agree on that.
Okay.
That the world of pure ideas has an uncanny traction on the physical world is strange. But stranger still is that for many scientists and mathematicians, there's a tuning between what our minds find beautiful and what is true. As if beauty points to what is true. Professor Frank Wilczek discovered one of the 4 fundamental forces of the universe, for which he won the Nobel Prize.
My earliest memories have to do with taking things apart and putting them together. I was very much a student of mathematics, so I always kind of had a feeling for that kind of beauty. When I first was drawn to it, I didn't really know how beautiful it was going to be, and the fact that this particular kind of thinking is actually what gives you a deep understanding of the physical world, that's a tremendous gift. Well, the more I thought about how it comes to be that our perception of the world at a deep level matches our perception of beauty, it's a puzzle. And the more I thought about it, the more it resonated. The more I realized that, well, first of all, I have been worrying about the beauty of quantum theory and the beauty of the deep description of nature all my adult life. When I was a graduate student, there was no decent theory of the strong force.
And the strong force is?
The strong force is what's responsible for holding atomic nuclei together. And at a deeper level, when we learn more about it, we learn that the building blocks of atomic nuclei, protons and neutrons, in fact, aren't the elementary particles. The elementary particles are quarks and gluons. Now, you could imagine dreaming up all kinds of equations, but we focused on equations that were beautiful, equations that had a certain simplicity and mathematical elegance.
And you decided to do that?
We decided to do that. It was also it's all we could do, you know. So the only hope, really, was to guess that the description is going to be beautiful, work out the consequences, and check whether nature agrees. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we did.
So the truths of science can be found in the pursuit of beauty. The question is this just poetry? Or is there some way our brains are actually made that links beauty to truth?
Philosophers have spoken of beauty in the abstract. Not only beautiful portraits, beautiful landscapes, but beautiful abstract art. And then you reach the ultimate question, which is mathematical beauty, because mathematical beauty is why mathematicians speak of mathematical beauty in poetic terms.
Professor Zecchi wanted to know if he could see a connection between mathematical truth and emotional beauty in the workings of the brain itself.
This is a part of the emotional brain, and this shows you the area of activity which correlates with the experience of mathematical beauty.
So when your mathematicians said, that's beautiful?
Not when they said that, but when they experienced it as beautiful. And then if you look at the regions of the brain which are active with musical and visual beauty, it's the same area of the brain that's active when you experience mathematical beauty, which actually mildly surprised me, because the experience of mathematical beauty is derived from a highly cognitive source. So there's visual beauty is a very sort of elementary visual source. This part of the brain is also part of the reward center of the brain and pleasure. So the question I would ask is, what is it about mathematics that people find so beautiful? The answer that I would give is that they find something in the logical deductive system of mathematics that makes sense.
We have a lot of beauty in our description of the world. It poses a deep mystery. Why should it be that way? Often when I start discussing this with people, they're very puzzled. Beauty is this subjective feeling that people have, whereas science is objective. Couldn't be more different?
I think that's a common view, isn't it? That beauty is merely subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder. And so what's really surprising is that this subjective feeling has traction on the physical world.
Yes, but there is a special kind of beauty, I think, that's associated with making successful predictions for how the world works. So that's a form of beauty that I think goes very deep.
You think it's an important one for science?
I think it's the important one for science.
When you say beauty, what do you mean?
It's easier to experience than to describe. I think it has to do with structures that have a kind of inevitability, that you can't change them very much. An aspect of symmetry is that if you try to change a symmetrical object, like take a circle and rotate it, it doesn't change. And some of the most beautiful things in mathematics and physics have exactly that symmetry property.
So symmetry?
Symmetry and productivity, or I call it exuberance sometimes, the idea that you get much more out than what you put in.
Right.
And a very small number of laws. You can write the laws of fundamental physics as we understand them easily on a T-shirt. And
the universe pops out of this.
And the universe pops out. That's.
So perhaps there is a world of ideas, a sort of platonic realm that our minds explore, and we do sometimes glimpse its beauty. And the universe did pop out of those few, almost austere rules which Frank Wilczek wants to understand. I suppose that's what I find the most amazing and puzzling. How does the messy riot of creation come from perfect rules?
I was a full-fledged Platonist before that really believed in symmetry as beauty and beauty as truth. What could be more beautiful and true than to have an all-encompassing theory of nature where all different forces are really a manifestation of a single force? So very compelling. I mean, we've had 3,000 years of monotheistic thinking, right? And so we are kind of biased to look for these one explanations, these absolute explanations, right? If you put the right glasses on, you would see that all that we see as different is really a manifestation of this single force. And so that's grand unification.
Sounds awfully religious to me.
It does, doesn't it? Sounds like monotheism.
Yeah, it sounds like God in a white coat.
That's exactly what I think. I think that even though I worshipped unification for many, many years in my career, I'm not like that anymore. I've sort of moved away because I don't see the point. There's no question that there are patterns in nature, they are repetitive, that can be described through mathematics in beautiful ways. But I think to just say that this sort of symmetry in nature is the hidden code, so to speak, that all you have to look for is that symmetry, is missing half of the story. The other half is the role of asymmetry in nature. A lot of stuff happens because of this imbalance between the two.
How about matter and antimatter?
Exactly. Dirac's equation predicts that there should be as much matter as antimatter in the universe. But when you look out, you find out that there is no antimatter out there. Very, very, very little, right? And that's good, because if there were as much matter as antimatter in the universe, we wouldn't be here, because matter and antimatter, when they come together, right, they disintegrate into a puff of gamma rays, very high energy radiation. So if you find your anti-person walking around, don't shake hands, right? And so, and I think it's this yin and yang kind of thing. You can't just look at this reverential perfection, symmetry as kind of the language of God, when nature is showing you that you really need both to make sense of things.
There is some beauty to this combination between symmetry and broken symmetry.
I think so, right? I mean, I have been proposing that there is what I call the aesthetic of the imperfect, right? I mean, there is this breaking of symmetry, and I think that we should embrace a combination of both.
I really liked the way he said that his symmetry and asymmetry.
Yeah.
He didn't say, look, symmetry's all wrong.
Yeah.
Here's something better. He said you've got to have both.
And the aesthetic of imperfection. That was cool. That was cool.
A lovely phrase, wasn't it? You need two seemingly opposite things, which together make something that's more creative.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's just coincidence.
These two things that sometimes seem opposite, you bring them together.
I suppose the question for me becomes, could there be a deep connection between beauty and creativity? And where in a material universe does creativity ultimately come from?
Mathematics is an art. The best mathematics is an art. It's totally creative. You have to throw your whole personality at it. Discovering mathematics is messy, like making love. It's messy.
It is that messiness at the heart of mathematics that Greg Chaitin's revolutionary work on randomness, done when he was still a teenager, has helped to explain.
Some of my most creative periods, I was ignoring women. I mean, I was terribly fascinated by them, but I was shy. And I put all this energy into mathematics. This was like a substitute for sex. I found mathematics absolutely sensual. I thought some proofs of mathematical theorems were as beautiful as a beautiful naked woman. If I had been chasing girls at that time, then there would have been no definition of randomness and no omega number. Sex and creation is the same thing. This is what motivates artists, and I think it's where you get the energy to do good scientific work also. It's the idea that we're a sort of a random product, that there's no purpose. Makes everything meaningless. Now randomness and atheism have become the new religion.
You think they've misinterpreted randomness?
Yeah. You see, one of the characteristics of randomness is unpredictability. Now, something is unpredictable if you couldn't predict it in advance. That's creativity. Yeah. So, in other words, randomness and creativity are practically different names for the same things. Can you have a mathematical theory of creativity? Well, it can't be a theory that will give you a mechanical procedure for being creative, because then it's not creative. So a mathematical theory of creativity has to be indirect. Creativity is by definition uncomputable. If we knew how to do it, it wouldn't be creative.
People often think that random means basically without purpose. It's meaningless. But you're saying that that's too simple of a way of thinking.
Randomness is a way of exploring different possibilities. That's where all the creativity comes from in evolution. The natural selection has to pick a possibility, but somebody's got to propose these new possibilities for organisms to see which one works. And randomness is doing that. And
randomness is creative.
Is creative.
So the idea of it's the opposite of meaningless almost. It's what creates the meaning.
It's looking for new meaning. It's creating meaning. When you have maximum creativity, it looks random because it's totally unpredictable from what you knew before. Yeah. That means that you're really being creative. You see? Yeah. So so randomness is the extreme of creativity. So there's this paradoxical aspect. So a mathematical theory of creativity is a more abstract kind of mathematics where you can prove theorems about creativity, you can describe it, maybe you can show it's highly probable, but you won't give you a way to mechanically produce creativity, which is the kind of thing that instrumental mathematics normally does.
It's interesting, there's a very famous tradition in theology which says that you can't speak about God, you can only say about what God is not.
Yes.
And so there's something interesting there with creativity. You can't nail down creativity, but you can say what it isn't.
Well, isn't God pure creativity?
Yeah.
That's
what you're saying. You're saying if you could nail it down, then it wouldn't be creative.
It wouldn't be creative by definition.
In the same way, theologians would say if you could nail down God, then that's by definition not God.
That wouldn't be God. That would be a limited being.
Yeah, exactly.
Some experiences of creativity and understanding allow us to grasp the truth. Others, by their sheer enormity, make us feel small. Scientists, as much as poets and the religious, have called these the sublime.
I think the sublime points at this sense of something greater than us that we didn't make. But it also points to something in us that is greater than what we normally feel, that we haven't shaped. And that's why the idea of the sublime is so important and why it enlarges us. At best, we're 6 by 2.5. But the sublime really makes you feel like an inward cathedral. The sublime really brings to the feeling of being human something much greater than being human.
So there is the sort of merely pretty, as opposed to the beauty that actually approaches terror. And that's the kind of beauty I experience when I'm looking at doing science or when I'm writing a novel. That's the beauty that I really crave.
What makes a beauty terrifying for you?
I think it's that sense of approaching a truth, the comprehension that we are in fact capable of having these huge realizations, ones that actually overwhelm us and make us feel that we are understanding something that we perhaps shouldn't understand. That we shouldn't go there, this idea of, where angels fear to tread. I think that's where the terror lies, and you come close to it when you understand something in mathematics. I do remember that feeling of beauty and the edge of terror.
It's like climbing mountains. You climb a mountain to get a better view, to see further. And one always feels that there are other mountain ranges that are higher. In the distance, you can see still higher mountains. And the ranges never stop, and it always gets higher. I mean, there's endless questions, and each question just opens more questions.
Do you see yourself as a religious person, Greg?
No. But I've been sort of driven to it by the mathematics I've been trying to do. I don't see myself as a religious person. I love going to the tops of mountains in the snow and seeing the view, feeling closer to God or close to the fundamental nature of reality. It's an illusion, perhaps. But I'm very interested in mysteries and deep questions. I'm very responsive to a feeling of transcendence.
This feeling of the sublime, a truth quite different from that which we find merely beautiful, also seems to be hardwired into the fabric of our brains.
Sublime is beauty from horror, or awe mixed with horror, or pleasure from displeasure. And it is something which philosophers have considered to be entirely a construct of the mind. In the 18th century, the awe and the horror and the beauty of it was seen in natural landscapes, Mont Blanc and Everest. So these were things which you could sort of contemplate. They were awesome and therefore beautiful, but they were also things which were terrifying. I was, however, expecting to see some activation in the medial orbitofrontal cortex here with the experience of the sublime. So
it would be beautiful.
Yes. So these experiments were very similar to the experiments on beauty. Big difference between the two is that there is no activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex.
Where you see beauty?
Yes.
Was that a surprise?
Yes, this was a bit of a surprise to me. This was a bit of a surprise. I was expecting to see some activity there, but apparently not. And in a way, language begins to make sense because the definition of sublimity is distinct from the definition of beauty. You see, beauty is, as Edmund Burke said, it's small, it's comprehensible, it's assimilable. Sublime is vast, it's awesome, and it makes you feel small. It's a very, very different experience.
One of the things I find fascinating when we're talking about a sense of a truth bigger than we are, and sort of was there already, so older, is that it's so close to how people describe encounters with the religious.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the religious sentiment.
In science.
In science.
Does that work for you? Because you see, Ard is religious and I'm not.
I think part of what makes science so beautiful, or that sense of beauty of science being close to the sense of terror, is that you do see something more clearly, and it's very beautiful, but it seems to point to something
beyond itself. And that's what generates that sense of being at a precipice, where you think it's beautiful, but it's also actually making the mystery more... There's more of a mystery rather than less of a mystery, even though I understand it, but it intensifies the mystery, even though you understand it better.
I think, for me, one of the greatest sort of moments of making peace with science was to realize that rather than taking away the mystery, it added to the mystery.
Why did you say I made peace with science?
Maybe at some point I was a bit suspicious of science. I thought maybe it would take away from my appreciation of the universe.
The minute you have images, you already have the beginning of narrative, because you have the beginning of the shaping of the way something can be perceived.
If mathematics is the language which gives us access to eternal truths of the physical universe, then could our ability to tell stories, the stories which help us make sense of the everyday events of our lives, be the facility which gives us access to other, but no less important kinds of truth?
A narrative is a natural part of consciousness and a natural part of the way the mind works. It's completely inevitable. The minute something disintegrates, the fall of a rock, the altered movement of a stream, the changing patterns of a wave, they're all elements of narrative.
When you were 14, you tried to go to university to study physics.
That's right, yeah. Well, I wanted to be a scientist. That was my first... that was one of my earliest. Slightly after, I wanted to be a pirate. And narrative is, I believe, a great neutral power. And it helps us shape reality. It helps us actually grasp what it is that we're experiencing. Without a sense of narrative locked into our DNA, the reality will be a great mess.
Do you think science itself has a narrative which it sometimes thinks it doesn't have? Because scientists like to say, we've got facts. They don't so often say, but we also have a narrative, a story of science.
Oh, I think science has a narrative. It's unavoidable. I'll give you a very simple example, because the whole idea of a wave and particle, I think those are two great poetic ways of perceiving reality, the wave and the particle.
But for all that stories can be beautiful and can move us, for scientism, they are, in the end, just stories.
Stories tempt us into thinking that we understand and that we know on the basis of the stories that we tell how to deal with these problems, and they never do. And so we have to stop thinking about these narratives as having any other function in our society than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Matters that give us pleasure and enjoyment and that move us. But now we know, when we compare those stories with the actual nature of human interactions, we should begin to recognize that for all their emotional value and for all their artistic beauty, they are not to be relied upon in the way science can be relied upon in order to order and arrange human institutions and cope with the vicissitudes of the future. You're very unhappy with that.
Yeah,
and a lot of people are unhappy with that. We know that psychologically stories are unavoidable, but it doesn't make them cognitively significant as a matter of identifying the true causal processes that drive reality.
Well, I think science is all about imagination. There's a huge synergy between actually arriving at the right narrative structure and the process of science as I experience it, which is recruiting these facts and then trying to think of a way in which they fit together that is coherent.
So in some sense, the scientific facts fit together to tell a story.
I think narrative is a very strong element in science. I think to me, narrative is where we're headed. I am a theoretical biologist, so theories are, of course, stories. So for me, it's not very interesting to just have a pile of facts. I mean, I can't think of any piece of science that's been done that doesn't take the facts and then construct from those facts something greater than the sum of the facts.
So maybe what would you say that what makes a scientific theory or narrative a good one is that it's fruitful, that it somehow goes on its own and does something that you didn't even think it was going to do when you put it together?
Yes, yes, that's it.
Sometimes a narrative or a poem goes somewhere you did not entirely intend it to go because of its own inner logic. You know, and this could be also the emergence of the theme, not just where the story goes. Actually, what it is about, you discover it in the process of doing it. It's quite terrifying that you start with something quite simple, and something turns up that there's no way you could have dreamt that it'll emerge. And I can see why this emergent idea you speak of is worrying to scientists, because it has to do with the element of control and the element of objectivity, the element of truth. But I think it's part of the wonder of what we do.
That was Rosenberg particularly said, well, several of them said, look, science has truth, we can prove things, and only things you can prove are truth, and art, literature, that's make-believe.
I wouldn't say that truth is only that which can be proven. The thing about a good story, especially one that has fascinated us for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, and the reason why they go on fascinating us is because they're things that are drawn from the great river of experience, of living and being here on this planet. So it's not make-believe at all. These are great inward truths of human life. The imagination is one of the most extraordinary faculties that we have. It's not an objective faculty, even though it draws its material from the objective. But it's the faculty through which we are able to be slightly more than just ourselves.
So it's interesting being here looking at things that probably haven't changed for 2,000 years. People come here and they trade camels, and it makes you think back to the times when, say, the Bible was written, which would have been in cultures probably much closer to this certainly than to our own Western culture. Sure. And what's interesting about these cultures is that they have often a much more sophisticated and nuanced way of telling stories with multiple layers.
Yes.
And so if you read the Genesis texts, you see there's something which has lots of different layers of meaning. And it's actually interesting, it's the Western fundamentalists, both on the religious side and on the atheist side, that have kind of flattened it into a scientific text. And the problem with that is that it just does complete violence to the text. It wasn't taken to be a journalistic or scientific narrative. The narrative is a very profound way of expressing truth, and sometimes if you try to take it out of the story context and line up a series of facts, you lose something. You lose exactly the bit that holds it all together.
Yes, I would say you lose everything.
Yeah. So let's ask ourselves, what are spiritual truths like? Are they more like the facts of physics that you can line up in this very neat way and capture in an equation? Or are they more like the truths of story?
But obviously the latter.
The latter, yeah.
I think that's what bothers me about some of what Rosenberg
I think he was
said.
uncomfortable with these narrative descriptions because he thinks that we use them to fool ourselves.
Well, I think he's right. I think we use narrative to fool ourselves, but he thinks being fooled is a dreadful thing. I would say we fool ourselves in the sense that we'll just act as if this is true, and once we're acting as if it's true, it is. In that sense, he's right, we fool ourselves. We fool ourselves into being better than our biology would allow us to be. How's that?
Well, I don't like the idea that we fool ourselves.
Ah, okay, no, you wouldn't.
Well, no, I think, what I think is that
I don't know why it's not enough for you, Art. Would it really be such a catastrophe if that's really all there was?
I think it becomes like sand that kind of all falls to your fingers in the end.
I think we left out this discussion a finding which is important, that moral beauty also correlates with activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex. We should have said that before, and I'm sorry I got rather lost. I did not say it. But there is a connection in terms of brain activity, in terms of moral beauty and visual beauty and musical beauty and mathematical beauty. And,
That's fascinating.
And the experience of someone beautiful as being somebody morally good probably reflects that.
So we get fooled sometimes by our brains looking at somebody beautiful.
You get fooled, that's right.